USS Liberty, a United States Navy signals intelligence ship,
since.
and all those who died during the attack by the IDF forces must be remembered every second. This is part of the story of the Zionist takeover of America. The non-Jew Zionists have a longer history than Jewish Zionists. The Crusaders,
The
before they
States
left
Navy
Europe,
Memorial
went around
in
killing
Washington,
Jews for God's
D.C.
blessing.
June the 8th, 2014. Every year, on the anniversary of the attack on the USS Liberty, survivors, relatives, and supporters gather together.
It's a remembrance of those who were killed that day, the 34. I'm Dave Lucas. I was in charge of the deck force. I was 25. My first child was born when I was one day out on that cruise. So as long as they're survivors and maybe children of survivors, I think this will probably be an annual event.
And salute.
The names of the 34 killed are read out.
Jack Raper.
Punctuated by the tolling of a Navy bell.
David Marlborough.
And the playing of taps, the traditional military funeral lament.
It's important to not forget what happened and to continue to try to find out why it happened and who made it happen.
In the summer of 1967, America was in turmoil. An incendiary mixture of racial discrimination and extreme poverty exploded into a summer of rioting in cities across the country. But one issue dominated. The Vietnam War. In all, 10,000 troops would die that year. The Americans were trapped. They couldn't leave, and they couldn't win. In the Middle East, too, war looked inevitable. There was growing tension between Israel and its Arab neighbors. Armies were mobilizing. Israel promised the White House they would not attack first, but on the 5th of June, they jammed radar sets at the US Embassy in Tel Aviv, so the Americans couldn't detect their jets taking off to launch a surprise assault on Egypt. Meanwhile, the USS Liberty was sailing across the Mediterranean into the war zone.
Liberty was a state-of-the-art intelligence-gathering vessel of the time, and what we did is we were a listening ship. My name is Lloyd Painter. I was a research officer. We could receive any signal that was out there, low band, high band, anything, intercepting it, recording it, and we did have on board some translators who could have immediate translation of what was going on. We would actually bounce signals off the moon back to NSA.
We're spies. I'm Jim Cavanaugh. I was a communication technician aboard the USS Liberty, and I intercepted Morse code. We're spies. I mean, we're intercepting messages from embassies, military bases, police, anything and everything that we could get to ensure that the United States was comfortable with what was going on in the world and no one's conspiring against us. And basically, it was to protect our interests.
This was the Cold War. American President Lyndon Johnson knew that the Russians already had substantial military influence in Egypt. He needed to find out what they were going to do next, to make sure that a local conflict did not become a world war, with the USA backing Israel and Russia siding with the Arab cause.
I was assigned as a Russian linguist aboard the ship. I'm Bryce Lockwood, United States Marine Corps, retired. The Israelis. Our primary purpose was to intercept communications of the Russian spy aircraft that were at Alexandria, Egypt, and that was our job, was to find them. We were not targeted against the Israelis.
Life was very relaxing. One of the nice things about the Liberty is we had air conditioning because we had communications equipment, so we were cool in the hot days. It was a very laid-back, very clean ship. It was spotless. The morale was pretty high, I mean very high.
By the time the Liberty arrived off the coast of Egypt on the 8th of June, the war had just 2 days left to run. Israel had seized the old city of Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. Jordanian forces were beaten, and Egypt was conceding defeat. Only Syria held out.
The airwaves were dead. The only voices we did get were those of Israeli or Hebrew was what we were hearing. My name is Bob Wilson. I worked for NSA on June the 8th, 1967, when the...
Much of Gaza lays in ruins. Attention may have moved away from here for now, but the conflict grinds on. Many have questioned Israel's alleged targeting and negligent killing of civilians in its conflict with Hamas. Buried in this rubble are the forgotten victims of this war. Often buried with them the stories of how they were actually killed. Some incidents are more high profile than others. This is the story of the death of one little girl. Her name is Hind Rajab, and she was 5. On January the 29th, with her uncle, aunt and 4 cousins, Hind crammed into a car to escape the fighting in the Tel Al-Hawa neighborhood of Gaza City. Within minutes, they were attacked. Their bodies and destroyed car were found 350 meters away from their starting point. These pictures, filmed by Sky News journalists inside Gaza, show the destroyed car. The black Kia Picanto is covered in bullet holes. Dozens of entry holes can be seen on the right-hand side of the car. After the initial attack, 2 people were still alive. Hind and her 15-year-old cousin, Leanne, who spoke to the Palestinian Red Crescent, begging for help.
Hello?
الو مرحبا عمو.
أنا مش عارفة تدخل علينا.
الو مرحبا.
أيوة تدخل علينا. الدبابة جنبك.
انتوا متخبيين؟
في السيارة احنا جنبينا الدبابة.
انتوا جوا السيارة؟ الو الو.
With the phone line dead, the Red Crescent rang back. Hind answered. She was now alone in the car. The other family members all killed. 4 children and 2 adults. Over 3 hours, in multiple calls, the dispatcher stayed in touch with Hind, trying to comfort her, scared and alone.
أجي أخذك؟ حبيبتي طيب أنا يا حبيبتي رح أجي أخذك. هلا عمو من الهلال عماله عم بنصك عشان إحنا نقدر نيجي ناخذك. حواليكي في ضرب رصاص؟
Rana Farki was the Red Crescent worker talking to Hind. We met at their offices in the West Bank. Nobody here can forget that day.
In all my time of working, I've not cried as much as that day. I know Hind's not the only story. I believe there are many stories more distressing than this in Gaza, but it was difficult because I was the one handling it.
After hours waiting for permission from the Israeli authorities, the Red Crescent say they received that permission to send help. This is disputed. The IDF says given the lack of forces in the area, there was no need for an individual coordination of the ambulance's route. The ambulance left from the Al-Hali hospital at 5:40 p.m. It was attacked a few meters short of the family car some 20 minutes later. This is the destroyed ambulance. Both paramedics were killed. And this is their radio communication with the Red Crescent in their final moments.
خليك معي. شايف السيارة أنت؟ مش شايف مشغل السرينة واللواح؟
Hind was left to die without help. Weapons experts told Sky News the damage shows the ambulance was hit with a large caliber weapon, with the projectile's exit hole visible at the back of the vehicle.
Any area, it is announced as a military zone, we are completely denied access to it. So that's why we have to seek coordination. Without coordination to ensure safety of our teams, we could not send an ambulance.
Sky News has examined satellite imagery taken on the day of the attack. It shows at least 15 military vehicles in the Tel Al-Hawa neighborhood, where the family's car was found. The closest military vehicle is just 300 meters away. This satellite image was taken at 4:31 p.m., just over an hour before the Red Crescent say they received approval to send an ambulance. Satellite imagery taken in the days following the attack show how a heavy military presence remained. At least 13 military vehicles on this day. A day later, at least 9 military vehicles are seen in the area near the Islamic University in Gaza City. The Israeli army said it was not in the area on the day of the incident. But their presence in the area was made public by them. 12 days after the attack, the IDF published a press release. It said over the last 2 weeks they conducted raids on terror targets with forces operating in Shati and Tel Al-Hawa neighborhoods in Gaza. The press release was later deleted from the IDF website. It's not clear why. Sky News has asked the IDF for comment. Further down the press release, the IDF embedded videos showing their movements in the area.
נמצאים בתוך המטה הראשי של אונר"א ברצועת עזה. אנחנו יכולים לראות איך למעשה אונר"א מאפשר.
Sky News geolocated the IDF footage released on the 10th of February, which shows 3 forces, the 401st Brigade, the Shayatet 13 and 52nd Battalion, operating less than 650 metres from the car Hind was found in. While it's not clear exactly what date the footage in the release was filmed, the IDF's presence in the area is undeniable. In response to this report, the IDF told Sky News it appears its forces were not present near the vehicle or within the firing range of the described vehicle, and that the incident has been passed on to a separate investigative body. Hind's mother wasn't in the car. There wasn't room. She escaped with Hind's little brother on foot. She wants someone to explain why her daughter was killed.
I am calling on the whole world to stand with us in the case of Hind, so those who committed this brutal crime are held accountable. I need justice for my daughter.
The Gaza war is in many ways unique as it's happening in a closed space with no escape, and no independent investigation on the ground about what is happening. What has happened, and what secrets lie beneath the rubble, may never be known. Stuart Ramsey, Sky News.
People. She was telling the story of her life as well, and this is what made her magically an icon.
She was there in every town, every Palestinian town, village, alleyway, refugee camp. She wanted to do the stories that nobody else wanted to do, and she gave a voice to a lot of people who we otherwise wouldn't have heard from.
We never assigned Shireen to do a story. I mean, she's just there. She shows up.
And that's what she did on the last day of her life. At 6:13 a.m., Shireen emailed the Al Jazeera office in Ramallah, saying she was headed to the Jenin refugee camp in the occupied West Bank to report on a raid by Israeli forces.
There was a response from the newsroom saying that, Shireen, we are waiting for you to be live on the top of the hour. Suddenly, right after that, 20 minutes after this email, we heard the news. Actually, we heard the news circulating on social media that Shireen was killed on the ground.
Shireen, يا عم شيرين! اسعاف! اسعاف!
Shireen had been shot in the head while wearing a helmet and bulletproof vest clearly marked with the word press. There's video of the moments after as people tried to reach her and the shooting continued. The journalists who were with Shireen said the shots were fired by Israeli soldiers. One of them was Ali Al-Samoudi, also from Al Jazeera.
To get themselves.
Experience very clearly demonstrates that in the cases of such killings of Palestinians, the announcement of Israel's desire or intention to investigate does not lead to accountability.
The investigation is an old trick. It's a strategy to muddy the waters, to obfuscate, buy time.
The Palestinians have launched their own investigation and say they plan to take their evidence to the International Criminal Court. The UN Security Council has also called for an immediate, thorough, transparent, and impartial investigation. It was a rare case of unanimity.
Notably, the council statement does not call for an international investigation. It's really quite vague and leaves it up to the parties to decide in this case. It's making clear that the Security Council wants to get to the bottom of this, but there's disagreement among council members about how to do that. So it's really left to the parties to work it out.
For Palestinians, not only did they lose a beloved journalist and member of their community, but on top of everything, they weren't allowed to mourn her in the way they wanted. The same day Shireen was killed, Israeli police entered her family home, took down a Palestinian flag, and told mourners to turn off patriotic music. They took down another flag outside a church where Shireen's family was receiving condolences. Shireen was a Palestinian Christian.
So this is what Palestinians here will tell you, not even I'm sorry. They don't even allow you to have... I'm moving slowly, okay?
And then there was what happened at the funeral. Israeli police said there was a plan made with Shireen's family to drive the coffin from the hospital to the church. Shireen's brother said there was no agreement. After people started to carry the coffin towards the hospital gates, this happened. Israeli police beat them back and threw stun grenades into the crowd.
This is unbelievable. Unbelievable. Oh my God. Such disrespect for the dead and for those who are mourning the dead.
Once the coffin was in the hearse, police continued trying to remove Palestinian flags. And at one point, they smashed the back window of the hearse to get to one.
This level of violence is part and parcel of the occupation, the very nature of the occupation. It takes a lot of abuse and violence to keep the population of Palestine without rights and subjugated.
Now, on the issue of Palestinian flags, an Israeli court recently ruled that it's not a crime to display one. But there's also a law that allows Israeli police to remove them if they judge that their display could disturb the peace. And police frequently make that judgment.
They want to show us that they are in control, that people cannot express their feelings, they cannot express their anger, they cannot carry a Palestinian flag, and they cannot be sad in the way that they want to be sad. So this is the regime.
Thousands of people crowded into Jerusalem's old city as Shireen's coffin made its way to the cemetery. It turned out to be one of the biggest gathering of Palestinian mourners in years. While all of this is hurtful and shocking for so many Palestinians, it's also unsurprising. Palestinians see everything that's just happened as the latest injustice in a long pattern of violence under Israel's occupation of Palestinian land. An occupation that's illegal.
An issue which has always been hotly contested, very much in the center of the propaganda battle waged over The importance of this report is that it's a detailed Israeli response to an issue which has always been hotly contested, very much in the center of the propaganda battle waged over the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. And this official finding goes against the report by a French television channel that this Palestinian boy, Mohammad Al-Dura, was killed by Israeli gunfire. The report that's been published today says there's no evidence that this was the case, and says that the incident has become part of a poisonous blood libel, as it puts it, against the state of Israel. The father of the boy who was killed, Mohammad, has immediately challenged the findings of the report and as has the French television channel, the journalist involved who says that he was never consulted by this Israeli investigation. So it remains a highly controversial issue, with both sides standing their ground and tussling over what has become a very, very famous image of the dark days of the second Palestinian uprising against Israel in September 2000. Clearly, this is an Israeli government report, and that has already been commented on since it came out, that there appears to be an attempt here by the Israeli authorities to exonerate the Israeli government from any responsibility, because there is a lot of evidence to the contrary. The evidence, of course, is also contested. That the most eloquent response perhaps comes from people who say, well, if Mohammad Al-Dura wasn't killed, where is he? And his father points out the boy is buried in the martyrs section, as it's called, of the Burej refugee camp in Gaza. So it's by far from being the end of the affair.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app, or follow us on social media.
Madam President, today most of the members of this council failed. They betrayed their own principles, their responsibilities to the innocent, and their duty to uphold justice. The resolution brought before this chamber was not a path to peace. It was a roadmap to more terror, more suffering, and more bloodshed. Many of you attempted to pass this injustice. We thank the United States for exercising its veto, for standing on the side of morality and justice, for refusing to abandon the hostages and their families. The text ignored the suffering of the 101 innocent hostages still held by Hamas in Gaza. Had it passed today, this council would have sent a message to the world that terrorists can act with impunity, that the United Nations will shield and surrender to murderers, rapists, and kidnappers, rather than holding them accountable. Last week, Sasha Trofanov should have celebrated his 29th birthday, surrounded by friends and family. Instead, he is being held by terrorist monsters who recently released a video showcasing his torture. Sasha is starved, his face bruised, his spirit crushed. Hamas doesn't just imprison, they torment, they dehumanize, they rejoice in their cruelty, and now they know that this council will do nothing to stop them. I would like to remind Ambassador Navzia that Sasha is a Russian citizen.
In fact, it's quite the opposite. We have the minister, the Israeli minister, who is in charge of the prisons, who's come out and said very unequivocally that the way that we can deal with overcrowding in prisons is to institute the death penalty. He himself has been reported as being one of the individuals who carried out torture against Palestinians who've been kidnapped. And so the situation that we hear of these people who've been coming out of State Teman by the way, Palestinians call it the slaughterhouse, is absolutely horrifying. Now, what happened on Monday was that for some reason, we're not entirely sure why, there was an attempt on the part of the Israeli military to try to question, and that's it, just question, 9 members of the Israeli army who are accused of gang raping one Palestinian man. And rather than people backing the military police or saying we don't want this done, it was quite the opposite. We ended up seeing 2 riots, one in the actual prison camp itself, it's a torture camp called State Man, and another one in another military base where there were not just rioters, but people who are members of the Knesset, including members of the cabinet, who came forward and say that these people are heroes and that there should be no restraints put whatsoever on Israeli soldiers. So the picture that is coming out is quite dire, and of course nobody's doing anything about it.
Oren Ziv, you're reporter and photographer for 972 magazine. You have a piece out just today headlined, "A Riot for Impunity Shows Israel's Proud Embrace of Its Crimes." If you could lay out your argument, you write that far-right protesters, soldiers, and MKs, that is members of the Knesset, rallied for guards suspected of raping a Palestinian detainee. Once fringe, they are now the public face of the state. If you could elaborate.
Thank you for having me. It's important to notice that while the Israeli media try to portray it as a struggle between the mob and the state, or between the army and the police that was not preventing this riot, although requested, I think it's important to see that today, because Ben Gvir and their allies are in the government and are leading those demonstrations, including breaking into State Iman, they are the face of the state, and those people are not extremists, they're the mainstream Israelis nowadays. In that sense, their sense of anger and surprise can be understood, because from the beginning of the war, since October, there was full or almost full impunity for soldiers. So we still don't know why this specific case was investigated and is being proceeded. But as Diana said, we're hearing many horrific evidence from prisoners that were released to Gaza, to the West Bank, or into 48 Israel. And it's not a unique case. So from the protester side, they understood, and the soldier, as we published in different investigations, the soldiers on the ground understood they have full impunity. They were looting, they were killing, they were shooting from the sky, from the ground. And the Israeli public got the sense from the politicians declaring, but also just from the day-to-day war, that soldiers are allowed to do whatever they want. And when an incident like this comes, a very rare incident that the military police is coming and arresting or detaining a few soldiers for questioning and might take them to court, people are angry because they believe that the Israeli military is allowed and have a backup to do anything. And this also shows us how Israel got to the ICC and to the ICJ with this kind of approach.
You were at Beit Lid Army Base on Monday where the protests were taking place. Explain where that is and where Seit Eman is, these 2 jails, prisons.
Seit Eman is an army base near Beersheba in southern Israel, and Beit Lid, where they were held, questioned, and later also brought to a military court, is in central Israel, not far so from the West Bank town of Tulkarem. So the protests on Monday started at Seit Eman with members of the government breaking into the place, and later, when they understood the soldiers were transferred to Beit Lid Army Base, to the military court and detention center, they moved there. Also there, a member of the government and of the Knesset arrived and were inciting against the army. And also there were hundreds of people breaking into the military compound. And at the protest, you could see also armed men with uniform and military weapons, probably soldiers, reservist soldiers that are friends or colleagues of the soldiers arrested. And they were protesting against the army with the army uniform and weapons. And this is a very common for Palestinians and activists in the West Bank, when you have soldiers that are actually settlers or a mixture of that. But inside Israel, since the beginning of the war, we haven't seen much of that, of this kind of militias operating. And they were, of course, also masked. And in general towards them, but towards also the people who were breaking into the army base. The police was doing absolutely nothing. As we learned later, the police was just, despite the fact the army was calling for the police, they just didn't show up, and the few policemen that were there were not doing much. I think it's important to see that this is kind of a struggle between the old establishment, maybe the center left, or the old people in the army that, believe that Israel has to have some legal framework, like to do the crime towards Palestinians, but to keep them proportional and some to investigate, to have some illusion or to present that Israel is investigating itself. And the other side is people like Ben-Gvir and their allies that think that soldiers who had full impunity and also are proud in their crimes, in the attacks against Palestinians. They document it on social media, as we've seen. And this is kind of the clash that is happening in the moment.
Diana, could you explain, you spoke to a young man named Bilal who described what he called engineered torture methods that were designed to break Palestinians.
Yes, what he talked to me about was that everything that was done was not, people often think of torture, and by the way, it should never be used, but people often think of torture as a means to try to extract information, and even then it's illegal. But in this case, it wasn't at all designed to extract information. It was just as a form of eternal punishment to show who is supreme. So he talked about how his hands and his legs were shackled, that there was a circle that was drawn around him with his eyes blindfolded and kept in a fetal position for 24 hours a day, that if he moved outside of the chalk, that he would be tortured. But it wasn't just that. It wasn't just him being tortured. He was then forced to witness other people being tortured as well. So he himself, the only time the blindfold was removed was to see other people being tortured, other people being raped. He also talked to me about how the small quantities of food that were being given to them, so much so that he got to the point where he was looking to see exactly how many calories were written on the various containers that he was given, because the whole point was to try to control how much food they were taking in. He ended up losing a substantial amount of weight while being held in prison, and is still undergoing very serious health problems because he was not allowed to use the bathroom for a number for about 60 days. He also talked about how all of the prisoners who've emerged, all of these kidnapped people, have scabies on them. They were denied the ability to take showers, and they were denied the ability to have even drinking water. So all of this, he said, was just as a means of showing who it is who is boss. They weren't at all doing torture to extract information. Again, that is illegal and should not be conducted. But in this case, it was a question of exerting one's superiority over them. They were told that they must understand that Israel is superior and that Israel can exact revenge anytime it wants.
This is Dr. Mohammad Abu Salmea, the director of Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza, who himself was jailed by Israel for 7 months without charge.
We were subjected to severe torture and my little finger was broken. I was repeatedly subjected to hitting on the head, causing bleeding multiple times. There was almost daily torture in the Israeli prisons.
And I was serving at a hospital that did predominantly reconstructive surgery for orthopedic injuries.
Both of you have been actively calling for the release of Dr. Hussam Abu Safiya, who was kidnapped by Israel. Ben, I know that you've met other doctors who were tortured. Can you share with us what they shared with you?
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know where to start, to be honest. The volume is insane. But I had done 2 months ago, I had started to do a study where I was interviewing medical students, in large part to learn what their experiences have been and how it's disrupted their medical education. Part of that interview process, I asked, it was about 20 medical students at various levels of medical school at the Islamic University of Gaza and the Al-Azhar University. I asked them sort of to describe the experiences that had disrupted their medical school education. And what I heard back was absolutely horrific. One example was a male medical student in his final year of medical school. He had been abducted during one of his rotations. He was held by the Israeli military, and it was about a week before one of his final exams. He was having, anxiety about the fact that he wanted to finish this clinical rotation. So he said to one of the guards, "Look, I really don't want to be here. I want to go back to my rotation. I'm not a terrorist. I'm a medical student. I have to go. I've been dreaming my entire life to be a surgeon." And the very next thing was the soldier shot off both of his thumbs. I've seen pictures of both of his hands. This is a medical student that I taught a couple years ago. And both of his thumbs have been shot off so that he can never practice surgery again. This is the depth of the depravity. Another man I saw, I was in Rafah for part of my time in March, and I was serving at a hospital that did predominantly reconstructive surgery for orthopedic injuries. And one of the men I saw, he had been working in a hospital in central Gaza as a physician. That hospital was bombarded and then subsequently invaded by Israel. He was instructed to leave, but he insisted that he had to stay to care for some of his patients who were unable to leave. He was instructed to strip at gunpoint, which he did with two of his colleagues who were similarly instructed to do the same. And he stood against a wall. When he asked, "I'd like to use the bathroom, can I please go to the bathroom?" he was told, "No, you have to use the bathroom where you stand." And so for what was initially hours and then was over 2 days, he stood against a wall with two of his colleagues completely naked, urinating and defecating on the floor immediately next to him. At the end of this time period, one of the guards came in and said, "Okay, you can go see your patients now." He wasn't allowed to dress, but he was seeing his patients while completely naked, and his patients are children. So this was a pediatrician who was instructed to round on his pediatric patients while completely naked. It's absolutely disgusting. The only reason I saw this man is that he was eventually displaced south. On his journey south, he had no access to his medications, which included insulin. So he was very, very sick when he arrived in the south. He'd taken no insulin for 4 days. And he had a wound on his heel, which was so deep that he ultimately needed a skin graft, which is why he was at the hospital that I was serving at. This is an experience that I was able to actually corroborate because one of the other physicians who was held at gunpoint with him in the room was also in the same hospital that I served at. It's absolutely disgusting that these things happen, and I wish I could say it's rare. I was there for only a few weeks, and legitimately, I was horrified by hearing this, and yet the Palestinian doctors I was rounding with were not shocked at all. This was something that they witnessed every single day. Another gentleman I saw wasn't a healthcare professional, but he was actually a farmer from the central area of Gaza. And he had been abducted by Israel. His hands were tied very, very tight, and his ankles were also tied together very, very tight. He had deep wounds around his wrist that were so deep I could actually see his wrist bones. He had what's called osteomyelitis, which is an infection of the bone because they were tied so tight. He also had a very large wound on the back of his hand. It was probably, I would say, probably 1.5 inch diameter hole in the back of his hand. And again, it was so deep I could actually see the bones and ligaments in his hand. Now, my practice in Canada and even doing humanitarian work, my work is predominantly doing chronic diseases. I don't do a lot of surgery. I'm not involved in surgical procedures. So that was a pattern of injury that I hadn't seen before. And I made the mistake of asking him how he got that wound. And I asked him that while there were Palestinian doctors around me, and I should have known not to ask it because it was traumatic what happened next. He had to describe to me what had happened, and what had happened is by his hands tied, they were never released. And every time he was moved from one location to the next, his feet were pulled up and he was dragged. And ultimately, when he tried to sleep, he would sleep like this. So again, putting pressure on the back. Or when he was pulled, he would drag, and the back of his hand, the skin would be pulled off as he was dragged from one place to the next. And ultimately, he had so much skin had been forced off the back of his hand that he actually needed a skin graft on the back of his hand. And I wish I could say this was rare.
places in Gaza. And hearing him now, it's almost like he heard the doctors that I spoke to that had been assaulted and abducted. I mean, they're describing the same thing. And the last thing I'll mention, and you talk about what happened to Dr. Adnan, that case, it wasn't covered in Western media, but everybody in Gaza knew about it. And that sort of reverberation of that sort of indignity that you're being treated with, that humiliation, even the idea of being stripped naked was something I heard the healthcare workers talk about who hadn't been abducted yet. And we're talking about we don't want to go through that, that humiliation part of it. Mm-hmm. So I think the downstream effect is really, really terrifying. And it it's a very insidious thing, that pattern of behavior that Ben's talking about.
So you're saying that it's discouraging people from sticking around or treating patients?
Well, I was at Al-Aqsa Hospital, and I remember one of the doctors who left when there was some threat and there was the hospital had been struck. And when he came back, some of the other doctors said, "How could you leave? Why did you leave?" He said, "Look at what they're doing to us."
Yeah.
This is, and he would talk about these examples, and Adnan Bush had not been killed yet. So this was it's like a well-established fact. It's like there is no respect for healthcare workers or hospitals. There is no line that won't be crossed. And so that's something that sticks in the psyche of many people in Gaza. Everybody wants to live with dignity and respect. And in Gaza, in that society, with the values that Palestinians have, that we care about, the last thing you want is to be on your knees or to be asking for help or sticking your hand out. And for this to happen to a prominent orthopedic surgeon like Dr. Adnan Bush, somebody who everybody knows, to see that sort of violation take place, I mean, it's stuck in everybody's head.
Which makes the fact that people do stay all the more unbelievably courageous and kind of unthinkably brave. When you guys were doing this press conference about Dr. Abu Safia, and you mentioned he was a dual citizen, I mean, I couldn't believe it. I hadn't heard that, and I couldn't believe it because it just makes his bravery all the more kind of stunning, and his selflessness. The fact that this guy could have gone to where is it? The fact that he could have done that and stayed there, and after his son was killed. I just want to, speaking of the Adnan al-Bursh, who again was the doctor who we knew was kidnapped, people didn't know where he was, and then he was in State Taman, by the way, and that's also, in addition to the rape cases there, that's one of the prisons that B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organization, they also called part of a network of torture sites.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I just want to show people how the New York Times reported. I mean, I guess it's in a way, wow, I can't believe they even reported on it at all. But here's how they reported on his death, which again, we know was basically following torture and sexual abuse. A Gaza doctor has died in Israeli custody, Palestinian groups say. Israel has not offered an explanation for the death of Dr. Adnan Ahmed al-Bursh, chief of orthopedics of Al-Shifa Hospital, 4 months after he was first detained. So honestly, I mean, the standards are so low that I was kind of shocked that they even reported on it. But of course, it's also disgusting that this is how they report on it. Typical passive voice exonerating Israel.
He magically died with no Israeli input or
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's important to actually say that, we start the clock on October 7th with regards to targeting of healthcare professionals and hospitals, and that's wrong. I think it's really important to know this is not a new tactic.
Right.
This strategy is longstanding. I mentioned Hammam Alo, who was killed, but a week after he was killed, Rafat Labad was killed. He was the head of internal medicine at Shifa Hospital. That the person that he replaced had actually also been targeted and killed by the Israeli military in 2019. And the reason I bring up 2019 is that's when the March of Return protests were. I attended the March of Return protests as a medic, and I was only there a couple times, but realistically, when I was there, I saw snipers shoot children in the head, 40 yards from me.
You witnessed it. Okay. I mean, I knew it happened, but you were
I testified to the ICC in 2019 about what I saw. And, in addition to seeing children being shot in the head, I saw healthcare workers be shot in front of me. One of them, my team put a tourniquet on her leg while she herself was attending and caring for someone who had been shot by a sniper. Instructive to that is the United Nations actually had an independent report on the March of Return protests. And that independent report stated that Israel committed war crimes, but that they intentionally killed and aimed and used sniper fire against unarmed protesters, people who were handicapped, children, healthcare providers.
The United States government is offering you a piece of land of your own.
We have our own land.
No, it's not yours. It's the U.S. government's.
Did they buy it?
No.
Did they trade for it?
It's not like that.
Then how can they own it? He has a point.
If you accept our offer, you won't have to hunt buffalo anymore or roam the prairie. You can depend on your country to take care of you.
You are not my country.
We will give you everything you need if you will just submit to living on a reservation.
We need nothing from you. Mr. Durant, if we could just...
I'm done, Reverend.
Well, let's talk now to our North America correspondent, Nomia Iqbal, and our Gaza correspondent, Rushdie Abu Alouf. And Nomia, to you first of all, despite all the condemnation we've had since Donald Trump made those first remarks, he's given more details today. What has he been saying?
He has given more details, but paradoxically, it's really vague as well. So as you said there, he has said that Gaza will be turned over to the US by Israel at the end of the war. He said that Israel would, presumably Israel will expel all Palestinians, and then the US would become the occupying power. And all this would be done without US troops on the ground. And then Gaza would be rebuilt, not using American money. Palestinians would be resettled elsewhere. But it is confusing because, bear in mind as well that Donald Trump has sold himself to his supporters, and this is what they love about him, as someone who doesn't believe in nation building. He doesn't believe in getting involved in conflicts overseas. So why would he want to get involved in such a complicated conflict? One of the hardest conflicts that has, sort of been really difficult for Americans to solve for decades. And so it looks like he's trying to have his cake and eat it, coming up with lots of different ways of, saying that, well, this is what our plan is. The other question is, what are you going to do about Hamas? How will you dislodge Hamas from Gaza? Because if Arab nations are going to get involved in the rebuilding of Gaza, which is presumably what Mr. Trump wants, they want an answer to that question. And Mr. Trump hasn't really answered that. And we know that the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, has said that he wants the war to end only when Hamas is completely destroyed. But defense experts say that that probably is not likely, it's impossible. So how long can this war go on for? Because Mr. Trump also wants peace. He wants the war to end ASAP. So whilst, yes, he's given us more details, it's so full of contradictions.
Nomia, just briefly, in those original comments, he talked about moving Palestinians out, enforcing that it would be permanent. The White House forced to actually row back and water down those comments.
Yeah, they're now using the term temporary. It's a temporary relocation. And his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, is also trying to walk back these comments. This often happens with Donald Trump. He proposes things and then the members of his own kind of team are trying to sort of explain what he actually meant. And Mr. Rubio said, this wasn't meant as a hostile takeover. This is actually a generous offer. We are showing willingness to rebuild and relocate. But I think for a lot of people, certainly Arab nations who are worried about this, for people for Gazans, I think the damage has already been done in some ways, and there's still a load of confusion around exactly what Mr. Trump's proposal is. But one thing I should add, Matthew, is that the big question about what happens to Gaza post-war has not really been answered. Even Mr. Netanyahu has dodged that question. So in some respects, Mr. Trump is trying to offer some sort of solution as to what happens to Gaza in the future, but it is, of course, a hugely controversial one, and one that's probably not going to get any backing from members of his own party.
Nomia, thanks very much. Let's bring in Rushdie. And a twin thought, Rushdie. Tell me more about what people in Gaza have been saying to you, reacting to what Donald Trump has said, and that call for an urgent Arab summit. Tell me more about that and whether that's likely to happen.
Yeah, there is very big confusion because a statement after statement from Donald Trump, but nobody knows exactly what's the plan is. But no, for Palestinians, no matter what the plan is, they're all rejecting the idea of displacement or leaving Gaza. In the official level, the Palestinian Authority issuing a statement, Hamas is issuing a statement saying that we reject that and we call the Arabs to hold urgent summit. But on the ground, in practical level, people are continue to return back to the north. So they are in practice refusing the idea by returning back to Gaza City. Well, they all know that Gaza is almost destroyed, especially the northern part that was subject to a very tough Israeli operation. What meant
of American citizens or allies, and this comes after the court issued arrest warrants for the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and his Defense Minister Gallant, and follows Trump restating his plan for America to take over the Gaza Strip. So lots to digest. Let's talk to Heidi Matthews, Professor of International Law at York University in Canada. Professor Heidi, if I may, first of all, this move to sanction the International Criminal Court, what do you make of Trump's justification?
Yeah, so Trump has done this before, right? In his first go around in the White House, he sanctioned are more wide-ranging, right? So the idea that anybody who's assisting the court would be subject to this kind of punishment effectively, encompasses perhaps thousands of people, right? Any expert witness giving testimony, anybody speaking to the prosecutor, certainly victims and witnesses in general, as well as a host of legal professionals. And so these sanctions are much more worrying.
Right. What do you feel about it as an international lawyer, as a criminologist? Does it, how much does it delegitimize? Does it damage the ICC?
Yeah, I mean, partly what we need to look at in the days ahead is how other states react, particularly states who are members of the ICC, right? And particularly those states, who have relatively more power vis-a-vis other states. So, I'm thinking about Canada, Germany, the United Kingdom, frankly, those in the global north who might actually be able to have a little bit more persuasive potential with respect to the United States. It really depends on how they act, and particularly how European countries respond, if they do so in a collective and united front to support the court, or whether they sort of
pander to Trump. And I think we're seeing a little bit of that, particularly in the UK right now, which is worrying.
Right. And what about Trump's other, he's been making the news pretty much on the hour ever since he became president again. This notion of Gaza and the legitimacy of his plans for the Strip, that Israel, once the fighting is over, will hand it over to the USA, the population will be resettled somewhere else, and then the US will turn it into some Dubai. Where's the legality in that? Well, what does the international law say about this kind of thing?
Yeah, so international law would say that this is preposterous, and all of these proposed actions would constitute flagrant violations of core principles of international law, and they would also constitute crimes, frankly, that would be covered by ICC jurisdiction. A couple of things here. One, I find it interesting that he talks about when the fighting is over, considering that he's, touting himself and his administration as having been central to securing the first stage of the ceasefire, which is now in effect. And so this gives me some pause as to whether or not the second stage will actually happen, which is quite worrying given the level of devastation that we see in Gaza. But in terms of the legalities, really what this is an attempt to completely deprive the Palestinian population in Gaza and the